Thomas lived alone in the wide open land, where the sky stretched endlessly and the fields seemed to go on forever. His small ranch sat quietly in the valley, surrounded by wooden fences, tall grass, and the slow movement of cattle. He was a middle-aged man with strong arms, weathered skin, and eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow. People in the nearest town knew his name, but not much else about him. He rarely visited, and when he did, he spoke only about supplies or feed for his animals. It had been many years since he had spoken with a woman. The silence was not just from choice, it was born from pain. Long ago, Thomas had a wife and a little daughter. They were the heart of his life, the warmth in his home, the reason he worked through storms and long days. But an accident had taken them away, leaving Thomas broken and empty. Since then, he had closed himself off from the world. He decided that his heart could not survive another loss. Each day, Thomas woke early before sunrise. He boiled coffee on the old iron stove, ate a piece of bread, and then stepped outside into the morning air. His work was heavy but steady, feeding the cattle, repairing fences, clearing the land, and making sure water reached the animals. His horses were his closest companions. He brushed them, talked to them quietly, and sometimes rode them across the hills. They never answered, but their presence gave him some comfort. The neighbors, living miles away, often wondered how Thomas managed all alone. Some admired his strength, others pitied his loneliness, but no one intruded. He had made it clear over the years that he preferred solitude. When people tried to invite him to town gatherings, he politely refused. When women looked at him with interest, he looked away. The town grew used to his silence, and eventually no one asked questions anymore. Inside his ranch house, Thomas kept few things. A wooden chair, a table, a bed, shelves with tools and supplies. But in one corner there was a locked chest. Inside were photographs of his wife and daughter, a small dress that belonged to the child, and letters his wife once wrote to him. He almost never opened the chest. Whenever he thought of it, his chest grew heavy, and he chose instead to bury himself in work. Life went on like this for years. Seasons changed: summer heat, autumn winds, winter snows, and spring rains. But Thomas remained the same. He carried his grief like a hidden weight. To him, women were like a distant memory, something he did not allow himself to face. He had forgotten the sound of soft laughter in the house, the feeling of warmth when someone cared for him. He lived only for the land and his animals because they asked for nothing more than food and shelter. But even in his silence, there were moments of longing. Sometimes, when he sat by the fire at night, he could almost hear his daughter's laughter in the crackling flames. Sometimes, when he walked through the fields at sunset, he imagined his wife beside him, pointing at the colors in the sky. These memories came like whispers, soft and painful, and they reminded him of what he had lost. The valley itself was both beautiful and lonely. In the mornings, the mist rolled over the fields, giving the land a quiet, dreamlike look. Birds sang, coyotes howled in the distance, and the river moved slowly through the rocks. Thomas often stopped to listen, feeling both comforted and reminded of his isolation. For years, he believed this was how life would remain, silent, predictable, and without new faces. He thought he had built a wall strong enough to keep the world out. But life has a way of surprising even the most guarded hearts. On one particular evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Thomas saw something unusual near the far end of his fence line. He narrowed his eyes, expecting perhaps a stray animal or the shadow of a deer. But the movement was too steady, too human. Though the details of that encounter would come later, the moment was important. It was the first time in years that Thomas felt the quietness of his ranch being disturbed by something alive, something unexpected. He did not yet know who or what was coming his way. He only knew that the air felt different, and for reasons he could not explain, his heart beat faster. That day, as he returned to the house and lit his lamp, he tried to push away the feeling. He told himself it was nothing, maybe travelers passing by, maybe shadows in the light. But deep down, something inside him stirred, as if life was about to place him on a path he never thought he would walk again. He went to bed early that night, lying awake on the old mattress, listening to the silence. His mind returned to his past, to the faces he missed, to the years of emptiness that had followed, and for the first time in many seasons, he wondered if the silence of his world would ever truly last. Thomas could not imagine that just beyond his fences, change was coming. He did not yet know that three strangers, carrying their own burdens and hopes, were moving closer to his land. He could not imagine that their voices, their presence, and their courage would soon challenge the walls he had built around his heart. For now, he remained the same middle-aged rancher who had not spoken to women in years. But the valley was shifting, the story was beginning, and his quiet life was about to be broken in a way he could never have predicted. The next evening came with an unusual silence. Thomas was walking back from the far side of his ranch, carrying a rope he had been using to mend a fence. The sun was already slipping behind the hills, turning the sky into a painting of orange and purple. He felt the cool air brush against his face and heard the steady sound of his boots on the dry ground. Normally, evenings were the quietest part of his day. They gave him comfort, a routine he could trust. But tonight felt different. As he neared the fence line, Thomas noticed shapes moving near the tall grass. At first, he thought it might be deer searching for food. He slowed his steps, his hand tightening around the rope. But then the figures grew clearer. They were not animals. They were people, 3 women walking slowly toward his land. Their clothes were worn. Their faces carried dust, and their steps looked heavy as if they had been walking for miles. Thomas stopped in his tracks. His heart began to beat harder. He had not spoken to women in so many years, and now 3 of them were approaching his ranch all at once. He felt uncertain, even uneasy. His first thought was to turn away, to avoid them, to pretend he had not seen them. But he was not a man who ignored someone in need, no matter how much he wanted to protect his silence. The women finally reached the fence. They looked at him with eyes that were both cautious and pleading. They were Apache women, their long, dark hair tied back, their faces showing signs of hunger and exhaustion. One of them, slightly older than the others, stepped forward. Her voice was soft but steady. She asked if he could give them shelter, even just for a night. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He did not answer right away. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, staring at the ground as if the dirt could give him courage. He had lived so long without women in his life that he did not know how to respond. But as he looked up again, he saw their tired eyes, the dust on their feet, and the way they clutched their small bundles of belongings. They were desperate. The younger of the 3 spoke next. She explained that they had been forced to leave their families and had nowhere else to go. They had walked for days, hoping someone would take them in. She said they would work hard, cook, clean, mend clothes, even help with the animals, if only they could stay. Her voice broke slightly as she spoke, and Thomas felt something stir deep inside him. Still, he hesitated. His life had been built on keeping away from anything that could open old wounds. He had spent years avoiding women, avoiding conversation, avoiding the chance of new attachments. Letting these women into his home could change everything. What if they reminded him of his wife? What if they stirred feelings he had buried long ago? What if opening his heart only brought more pain? The 3rd woman, the quietest of the group, finally lifted her eyes to meet his. She did not speak many words, but the look in her eyes said enough. It was the look of someone who had lost much, who carried pain, yet still carried hope. Thomas could not turn away from that. He cleared his throat and finally spoke, his voice low and rough from lack of use. He told them they could stay by the barn for the night, but he made no promises beyond that. The women nodded quickly, grateful for even a small piece of shelter. They followed him quietly as he led them across the ranch. When they reached the barn, Thomas lit a lantern and set it down on a wooden crate. The warm glow filled the space, showing the hay piled in the corner and the tools hanging on the wall. The women looked around with relief, as if the barn was a palace compared to the open land they had been walking through. Thomas fetched some water from the well and placed it in front of them. He also brought out a small loaf of bread he had been saving for himself. Without a word, he placed it down and stepped back. The women broke the bread into pieces and shared it among themselves, eating slowly as if every bite mattered. Watching them, Thomas felt something unusual, an ache, but not the painful kind he was used to. It was an ache of seeing people in need, of being reminded that life was more than fences, cattle, and silence. After they ate, the women sat together near the hay. They spoke softly to one another in their own language, voices rising and falling like a gentle song. Thomas did not understand their words, but the sound was strangely comforting. It reminded him of the days when his wife used to hum while cooking, filling the house with warmth. He stayed by the barn door, watching the sky turn dark and the stars appear one by one. His heart was restless. He wanted to keep his distance, to return to his lonely house and shut the door. But his feet did not move. Something kept him there, as if he was afraid that if he left, they would disappear, and with them, the strange feeling of life returning to his ranch. When the women finally lay down to rest on the hay, Thomas quietly walked back to his house. Inside, he sat at the table, staring at the wooden chest in the corner. He thought of his wife, his daughter, the laughter that once filled these rooms. For years, he had believed that his life would remain locked in silence. Yet now, 3 strangers had appeared at his door asking for help. He rubbed his tired eyes and whispered to himself that it was only for one night. Tomorrow, he would send them away. Tomorrow, things would return to normal. But as he lay in bed, sleep would not come. He kept seeing their faces, their eyes full of exhaustion and hope. He knew deep down that tomorrow might not be so simple. Outside, the ranch was quiet again. The cattle shifted in their pens. The horses snorted softly, and the barn held 3 women who had placed their trust in a man who had forgotten what it meant to be trusted. The night stretched on, and with it, Thomas's thoughts grew heavier. By morning, nothing on the ranch would feel the same. The morning sun rose slowly over the valley, casting a golden light on the land. Thomas was already awake, as he always was, moving through his chores. He filled buckets of water, scattered feed for the chickens, and checked the fences along the corral. But his mind was not calm as it usually was. He knew the women were still in the barn, and he could not shake the thought that their presence would change his quiet life. He told himself again and again that they could not stay. It had been years since he had opened his life to anyone. Letting strangers remain on his land felt dangerous. He had worked too hard to build his walls to keep his heart safe from loss. But when he looked toward the barn and saw smoke rising from a small fire they had lit to keep warm, his resolve began to weaken. After finishing his morning work, Thomas walked to the barn with slow steps. The door creaked open, and he saw the 3 women sitting together. They had already cleaned the space where they had slept, stacking the hay neatly and putting the lantern back in its place. One of them was stirring a small pot of broth made from wild herbs they must have gathered along the way. When they noticed him, they stood quickly, almost as if afraid he would send them away at that very moment. The older woman stepped forward, her voice respectful yet firm. She told him they were grateful for his kindness and asked once more if they could stay. She explained that they did not want charity. They would work, cook, clean, mend clothes, and even help care for the animals. All they needed was a safe place to rest. Thomas stood silently, his eyes shifting between them. The younger woman spoke next, her voice softer. She said they had been walking for days, and this ranch was the first place where they felt they might belong. She promised they would not be a burden, only help. For a moment, Thomas thought of refusing. The words were at the edge of his lips, ready to come out. But then he saw the 3rd woman again, the quiet one, watching him with steady eyes. There was no fear in her look, only a kind of silent strength. Something about her gaze reminded him of his daughter, innocent yet determined. He felt a lump rise in his throat. He cleared his voice and said they could stay for a little while, but only if they worked hard. He explained that the ranch was not a place for idleness. There was always work to do, animals to feed, fences to repair, fields to tend. If they wanted shelter, they would have to share in those burdens. The women nodded quickly, relief flooding their faces. They agreed to do whatever was needed. That morning, without being asked, they followed him as he moved about the ranch. One gathered eggs from the henhouse, another carried water from the well, and the quiet one brushed down one of the horses. Thomas watched them out of the corner of his eye, surprised at how naturally they worked. It had been years since he had seen anyone else's hands labor on his land. At midday, the women prepared a simple meal from what little they had, adding herbs to boiled potatoes and serving it with fresh eggs. They placed the food on the table in his house, though they hesitated to sit down until Thomas motioned for them to join him. Eating together felt strange to him. For so long, his meals had been silent affairs, just him and the crackling of the fire. Now there were voices, quiet laughter, and the sound of bowls being passed. Though he did not talk much, Thomas listened. He listened to their stories about their families, about the places they had walked through, about the hardships they had faced. Their words painted pictures of struggle and survival, of courage in the face of displacement. For the first time in years, his house was filled with human voices, and it unsettled him almost as much as it warmed him. That night, after the women returned to the barn to sleep, Thomas sat by his fire in deep thought. He remembered the promise he had made to himself years ago, that he would not let anyone get close again. Yet here he was, allowing 3 strangers into his life. It felt dangerous, but it also felt alive. The following days tested his decision. The women rose early, often before Thomas, and began helping without waiting for instructions. They cleaned the house, which had long been covered in dust. They washed his clothes, patched worn shirts, and even cooked meals that reminded him of flavors he had forgotten. The quiet one began singing softly as she worked, her voice low and calming. It drifted through the ranch like a gentle wind. Thomas tried to remain distant. He spoke in short sentences, gave orders, and avoided long conversations. But little by little he found himself softening. He noticed how carefully they treated his animals, how kindly they spoke to each other, and how much lighter the ranch felt with their presence. Still, doubt gnawed at him. At night he lay awake thinking about the risk. He worried about what the neighbors might say if they found out he had 3 women living on his ranch. He worried about the pain of growing attached only to lose them someday. His past had taught him that life could take away the people he loved in an instant. Could he really allow himself to open that door again? One evening, as the sky turned dark and the stars began to shine, the older woman approached him. She thanked him again for letting them stay, and told him that his kindness had given them hope they thought they had lost. She said that sometimes life brings unexpected connections, and maybe they were meant to find his ranch. Her words echoed in Thomas's heart long after she returned to the barn. He knew she was right. Life had a way of surprising him, no matter how hard he tried to keep it predictable. Perhaps letting them in was not a mistake. Perhaps it was the beginning of something he needed, even if he did not yet understand it. As the days passed, the women's presence became less of an intrusion and more of a rhythm. They became part of the ranch, part of the work, part of the life that Thomas had thought was long gone. And though he still fought against his own fears, he began to see that the walls he had built around his heart were not as strong as he once believed. The choice he made that morning, to let them stay, was not just about giving them shelter. It was about giving himself a chance to feel human again, to be part of a world that had voices, warmth, and connection. It was the beginning of a slow, quiet change that he could not stop, even if he wanted to. And deep down, Thomas knew this choice would lead him somewhere he had never expected to go. The days on the ranch slowly began to take a new shape. Where there had once been silence, now there was the sound of voices, laughter, and movement. Thomas noticed the difference each morning. Before the sun had even fully risen, the women were already awake, preparing food, carrying water, or tending to the animals. The ranch, which had once felt too big and too empty, now seemed alive in a way he had not felt for many years. Thomas still kept a careful distance. He was a man of few words, and his heart had been closed for so long that he was unsure how to open it again. But he could not deny the changes around him. His house, which had grown dusty and quiet, was now swept clean. Fresh meals appeared on the table, and clothes that had been worn thin were mended neatly. The barn, once only for animals and tools, now carried the soft sound of voices at night, voices that gave the valley a warmth it had not known in years. One of the women, the older one, had a way of organizing everything with calmness. She directed tasks, helped Thomas plan for the work ahead, and even suggested better ways to manage the cattle. The younger one carried a light spirit. She laughed easily, sometimes even at Thomas's serious face, and her energy brought a brightness to the long workdays. The quiet woman, though, seemed to touch Thomas's heart most deeply. She did not speak much, but her actions spoke for her. She was gentle with the horses, patient with the chickens, and careful when handling the tools. Her quiet strength reminded Thomas of the things he had once loved about his wife, the kind of strength that did not shout, but steadied everything around it. Over time, Thomas began to speak more. At first, it was just simple words. "Hand me that rope," or "Close the gate behind you." But little by little, sentences grew longer. He began to explain how to care for the cattle during the dry season, how to watch the sky for changes in the weather, how to repair a broken fence post so it would last longer. The women listened closely, eager to learn, and he found himself surprised at how natural it felt to share his knowledge. Meals became moments of connection. The women prepared stews with wild herbs, fresh eggs, and sometimes rabbit or fish they managed to catch. Thomas, who had grown used to eating bread and beans alone, began to look forward to the meals. At first he sat stiffly at the table, unsure of what to say. But their gentle conversations, their stories, and their soft laughter pulled him in. He began to share small pieces of his past. Not everything, not the deepest pain, but little stories about the land, about his childhood, about the ranch when it was new. The women, in turn, told him about their traditions, about songs passed down through generations, about ways of living close to nature. Sometimes in the evenings the younger one would sing softly, her voice carrying into the night air. The sound reached Thomas's ears while he sat on the porch, and though he did not understand the words, he felt their meaning. The song filled the silence with something gentle and healing. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas stood by the corral as the sun dipped low. The quiet woman joined him, carrying a bucket of water for the horses. For a long while they stood side by side, saying nothing. Finally, she turned to him and said softly, "Your land is strong, but you are stronger for keeping it." The words were simple, but they struck something deep inside him. No one had spoken to him like that in years. He only nodded, unable to find an answer, but her words stayed with him long into the night. Trust grew slowly, like seeds planted in the soil. Thomas no longer felt like he was living alone in a silent world. He still carried his grief, still woke some nights with memories of his wife and daughter heavy in his chest, but the weight was changing. It was no longer crushing him the way it once had. Instead, it felt like something he could carry while still moving forward. The neighbors, who rarely came by, began to notice changes too. When they passed the ranch, they sometimes saw Thomas walking with the women, showing them how to lead the cattle or guiding them through the fields. Some whispered in surprise, others in curiosity. Thomas had been silent for so long that no one expected him to welcome anyone, especially women, into his life again. But Thomas paid little attention to what others thought. He knew this change was his own, and it was shaping him into someone he had thought was gone forever. There were challenges too. Life on the ranch was never easy. Fences broke in storms, coyotes threatened the chickens, and water was sometimes scarce. But instead of facing these problems alone, Thomas now had help. The women worked hard, sometimes harder than he expected, and their determination surprised him. They did not complain about long days or heavy work. Instead, they faced each challenge with quiet strength, and Thomas realized he had underestimated them. Little moments began to mean the most. He noticed how the younger one laughed when she managed to ride one of the horses for the first time. He noticed how the older one hummed while she cooked, filling the kitchen with warmth. He noticed how the quiet one often stood beside him in silence, and how that silence no longer felt empty but shared. These moments, small as they were, reminded him that life could be more than survival. It could still hold connection even after loss. At night, when the women had gone to rest in the barn, Thomas sat by his fire and thought about how far he had come. Just months ago, his life had been nothing but routine, work, and silence. He had believed that was all he deserved, all he could handle. Now his home was filled with life again. It frightened him, but it also gave him a sense of hope he had not known in years. One particular evening, as the stars shone bright above the valley, the older woman spoke to him by the porch. She said, "You gave us a home when we had nothing. You may think we needed you, but maybe you needed us too." Thomas looked at her, wanting to deny it, but the truth was clear. He did need them. Not just for the work they did, but for the life they brought back into his world. That night, Thomas walked back inside his house and opened the old chest in the corner. He looked at the photographs of his wife and daughter, at the little dress folded neatly, at the letters that had long been sealed away. For the first time, he did not feel crushed by grief. He felt sadness, yes, but also gratitude. His family would always be part of him, but maybe, just maybe, life was giving him another chance to feel whole again. The walls he had built were not gone, but they were no longer unbreakable. The women had not forced their way in. They had simply lived with honesty and kindness until those walls began to crack. And Thomas, though still afraid, was learning to let the light through. The seasons began to change, and with them the rhythm of Thomas's life shifted into something he had never expected. What was once a quiet ranch filled only with the sounds of animals and the creak of wind through the fences was now a home filled with voices, footsteps, and laughter. It had been many years since he had allowed himself to feel that kind of warmth, and though part of him was still cautious, another part was grateful. The three women had become a natural part of the ranch. The older woman took charge of planning meals and keeping things in order. She seemed to understand what Thomas needed even before he spoke. The younger one brought a liveliness that reminded Thomas of the days when his daughter used to run around the yard, curious about everything. And the quiet woman, though she spoke little, seemed to anchor them all. Her steady presence gave Thomas a peace he had not known in a long time. Neighbors who passed by began to notice the change in Thomas. Once known as a man who avoided people, who barely spoke in town, he was now seen walking with the women, teaching them how to handle cattle, or showing them how to ride a horse. Some of the townsfolk whispered about it, surprised to see him in the company of women after all these years. But those who came close enough also saw something else. Thomas was smiling again, something no one had seen since the tragedy that had taken his family. At first, Thomas worried about what people might say. He had lived with silence for so long that he did not know if he could handle the weight of gossip or judgment, but he quickly realized it did not matter. The opinions of others could not compare to what he felt each day on his ranch. The women were not only surviving there, they were thriving. And in helping them find safety, Thomas himself was finding healing. There were moments that proved to him just how much things had changed. One afternoon, a storm rolled in suddenly with heavy winds and pounding rain. The cattle grew restless, and Thomas rushed out to bring them to shelter. To his surprise, the women ran out too, working alongside him in the mud and rain. The older woman guided the calves into the barn. The younger one carried feed to calm them, and the quiet one held tightly to a horse that threatened to bolt. Together they weathered the storm, and when it was over, they all stood soaked to the bone, laughing in relief. Thomas had never shared such a moment with anyone since his wife and daughter. That day he realized he was no longer alone in carrying the weight of the ranch. Evenings became the most precious time. After the work was done, they often sat together near the fire. The women told him stories of their childhoods, of their parents, of traditions passed down through generations. Sometimes they sang songs in their language, their voices blending together in harmony. Thomas would sit quietly, listening, feeling a sense of belonging he thought he had lost forever. One night, as the stars shone bright above the valley, Thomas found himself speaking about his wife and daughter. He had never shared much of that part of his life with anyone in years, but the words came slowly, almost naturally, in the warmth of their company. He told them about his wife's laughter, about his daughter's curious eyes, about the accident that had taken them away. The women listened in silence, their faces soft with understanding. No one interrupted. No one tried to fill the silence afterward. They simply sat with him, sharing his grief without judgment or pity. And in that silence, Thomas felt lighter, as if the burden he had carried alone for so long was finally being shared. The ranch was not without challenges. There were days when water was scarce, when coyotes threatened the animals, when fences broke, or when the land demanded more work than their bodies wanted to give. But instead of facing these hardships in solitude, Thomas now faced them with companions. Their presence did not erase the difficulties, but it gave him strength to endure them. Every task became easier when it was shared. Over time, the ranch transformed in ways Thomas could not have imagined. The house was cleaner and brighter, with small touches of care, flowers placed in a jar on the table, blankets neatly folded, meals full of flavors he had not tasted in years. The barn, once only a place for animals, now carried signs of life: woven mats on the ground, lanterns that glowed warmly at night, laughter echoing through the wooden walls. But the greatest change was not in the buildings or the land. It was in Thomas himself. He found himself talking more, smiling more, even laughing at times. He felt lighter when he woke in the mornings, and though the grief of his past never fully left him, it no longer controlled him. He was learning that it was possible to carry both pain and hope in the same heart. One evening, the older woman said something that stayed with him. She told him, "When we came here, we had nothing. You gave us a place to stand. But you gave us more than shelter. You gave us a chance to live again. And in return, we see that you have begun to live again too." Thomas did not answer right away, but he knew she was right. What began as an act of reluctant kindness had turned into something much greater. The quiet woman, who rarely spoke, also shared a few words with him one night. She said, "You thought you were only giving us a roof, but you gave us hope, and hope is stronger than shelter." Those words touched him deeply, and he carried them with him in the days that followed. By the time months had passed, Thomas could no longer imagine his ranch without the women. They were no longer guests or strangers. They were part of his life, part of his land, part of his healing. Neighbors who once wondered about him now saw a man who had found purpose again, and the ranch, once silent and lonely, became a place of life and connection. Thomas often thought back to the first night he saw them near his fence, tired and desperate. He had been ready to send them away, ready to protect his silence at any cost. But something inside him had shifted that night, and now, looking back, he realized it was the best decision he had made in many years. The story of his life had been rewritten, not with grand gestures or sudden miracles, but with simple acts of trust, kindness, and shared work. The women had found safety, and he had found healing. Together they built not just a home, but a family of sorts, bound not by blood, but by the strength of what they had endured and the hope of what they were building. As the sun set one evening, Thomas stood on his porch watching the women laugh together near the corral. The sky glowed in shades of gold and red, and the air carried the sound of life across the valley. For the first time in many years, Thomas felt truly at peace. He knew the road ahead would still have struggles, but he also knew he would never face them alone again. His heart, once closed and silent, had been opened by 3 strangers who had walked into his life with nothing but hope, and in giving them shelter, he had found shelter for his own soul.